Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to GasWorld Webinars with me, Thomas D.
And me, Rob Cockerell. Over the past few years, medical oxygen has moved from being an invisible backbone of healthcare to a global priority. Following the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen health systems around the world strengthen their oxygen strategies and accelerate investment in on-site generation.
And yet, major gaps remain. Oxygen shortages persist in low-resource settings, infrastructure and technology is aging, and the need for safer, more standardized equipment has never been higher.
And today, in this exclusive GasWorld webinar, we have brought together a panel of industry experts and innovators working to tackle those very challenges. Over the next hour, we're going to hear from representatives from the Access to Medicine Foundation, LeanMed and GCE to explore where the medical gases industry stands today.
And you, the viewer, will have the chance to get your questions answered too in our live audience Q&A near the end of the webinar. So if you have a question for any of our speakers, then please do submit it as soon as possible.
Yes, please do get those sent in, but we have a lot to unpack already, so let's get this webinar firmly underway and hear from our first speaker, Steffi Van Uytfanghe, Company Engagement Officer at the Access to Medicine Foundation.
Steffi leads the Foundation's medical oxygen program and engages with gas companies and other stakeholders to improve access to medical oxygen in low and middle income countries. She has a background in pharmaceutical sciences and global health with experience spanning research on cardiovascular risk profiles in underserved township communities, roles in the pharmaceutical industry and international emergency preparedness and response.
Steffi, thank you for joining us today on the webinar. Now, many of today's viewers will, of course, be familiar with the Access to Medicine Foundation and the work that you do. We've heard from your CEO, Jay Ear, at some of our previous events. However, viewers may be less familiar with the Global Oxygen Community of Practice, an initiative that you established earlier this year. So please tell us all about this and the work you're doing to improve access to medical oxygen.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak on this important topic. So at the Access to Medicine Foundation, we usually focus on areas where a relatively small group of companies control the global supply of an essential health product. And so in these markets, our role is then to apply evidence-based insights to build partnerships, start conversations, and encourage practical action. And so in short, we create shared platforms where companies can come together and drive real change. And so, of course, the COVID pandemic exposed many long-standing weaknesses, gaps in oxygen systems in many low and middle-income countries. And so while the demand for oxygen surged overnight, many countries actually struggled with limited production capacity, insufficient distribution networks, lack of technical and maintenance support that is, of course, needed to keep equipment running. And so the pandemic made it very clear that ensuring reliable access to oxygen is not just a matter of emergency response, but it needs to become like a core component of resilient health systems. And so that's why we at the Access to Medicine Foundation began engaging with the oxygen industry companies in 2019. But in the beginning of this year, we partnered with the Global Oxygen Alliance, or GO₂AL, to establish the GO₂AL Community of Practice, which is a first ever multi-stakeholder industry network that is dedicated to increasing oxygen access. And so this network covers the full oxygen ecosystem, so from producers to distributors to oxygen delivery to the patient. And so our community of practice, our aim is to strengthen collaboration across these actors and then to influence and advance oxygen access in low and middle income countries, and then to develop industry-built scale-up models that demonstrate public-private partnerships. And for the rest of 2025, through the end of 2026, we are focusing on 3 pilot countries. So that's South Africa, Senegal, and Uganda. And in these countries, we aim to identify oxygen gaps, understand the oxygen industry's challenges, strengthen local partnerships, and then explore solutions. And so the lessons that we learn from these country teams will then inform how similar approaches could be adapted or applied to other low and middle income countries. And so by the end of 2026, we will share these scalable solutions and strategies in a report.
Fantastic. Thank you for that introduction there, Steffi. And who are the types of stakeholders involved in this initiative? And on top of that, if companies did want to engage with you or get involved in this initiative, then how could they do that?
Yeah, so well, as I mentioned earlier, we began engaging with the oxygen industry back in 2019. Though at first these were mostly liquid oxygen companies. But when we started the community of practice program, we quickly realized that many of the barriers to oxygen access required a way broader approach. So simply donating or purchasing oxygen plants isn't enough to get oxygen to patients on long term. So you also need to think about like training, spare part supply, maintenance, repair, many other factors. And to really find solutions for these challenges, you really have to look at the entire system. And so that's why we decided to involve actors from across the entire oxygen ecosystem. So we work with, of course, producers of liquid oxygen, PSA plant suppliers, concentrators, and even innovators like, for example, Mark from Linemet, who's here today. We also engage with companies involved in more the distribution side, so supply, logistics, also equipment manufacturers, and then those more focused on the patient side, so providers of respiratory therapeutics. And of course, a range of development sector organizations focused solely on oxygen access and the related services. Also in our 3 pilot countries, so as I mentioned before, that's South Africa, Senegal, and Uganda, we're working with the regulatory agencies and their ministries of health, because of course they play a very crucial role in oxygen access as well. Because if COVID taught us one thing, it's that governments cannot solve this alone, and the private sector cannot deliver its full potential without the right policies, coordination, a clearer, I want to say like more coordinated regulatory pathways. And so effective public-private partnerships are essential for building reliable access. So like I said, we're not only focusing on oxygen producers. Our network includes a wide range of stakeholders, and they all have their important part to play in the oxygen life cycle. And so we welcome more oxygen companies to join the initiative, especially those with experience or activities in Senegal, South Africa, and Uganda. Participation is free. We hold 1 meeting per month for each pilot country. And I do believe this is a good moment to join, because once the work in the pilot country starts, it may be harder to catch up. So if you're interested, you can find my email under my name on access2medicinefoundation.org. And please get in touch.
Absolutely, please do. Great to see such engagement. And the group meets several times a year for various discussions. Your most recent roundtable was just over a week ago. So what are some of the achievements you've reached, and how does this tie into your next steps?
Yeah, indeed. So our community has now met 3 times. We've had 3 roundtables, and we've had 1 kickoff meeting for the Uganda community of practice. In terms of achievements, first, as I mentioned before, this is the first ever effort to bring together this oxygen group of companies. And I believe that multidisciplinary approaches are essential given the very complex and multifaceted oxygen access challenges that we face. And so at our last roundtable, 38 oxygen companies and organizations from across the oxygen ecosystem from all over the world showed up. And yeah, mind you, these are, some of these are competitors. Others who had not previously worked on oxygen access are now discussing it internally. They're contributing their time, sharing data, and actively participating in our community. Then secondly, of course, we have identified the key oxygen access challenges that the oxygen industry is facing through our roundtable discussions, bilateral meetings. So yeah, that's of course an important part. And then thirdly, like I said before, we launched these smaller country-specific communities for our 3 pilot countries, which then will create a foundation for focused collaboration and for future pilot initiatives. So I do consider those as achievements, but I do want to emphasize that we're only just getting started. Like, we're trialing something new here, and the most significant outcomes are still ahead. So we aim to use these pilot countries as proof of concept sites, and there's already work underway by our members in the pilot countries. For example, supply chain mapping in Uganda by the Oxygen Co-Lab. I believe LeanMed is also working on a gap analysis in Uganda. And we are, as a coordination team, we're looking on how to coordinate these efforts, maximize their impact in the pilot countries. I can also give another example. So, like, at our last roundtable meeting, we mainly focused on regulatory challenges to oxygen access and how to address them. We heard from a speaker from the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, who shared regulatory barriers they had identified for specifically South Africa. And then they followed up with, what's their advice on how to potentially remove those barriers. For example, she highlighted the urgent need for clear national regulatory guidelines for oxygen. And so through the Global Oxygen Alliance, we're now working to address this and to determine, like, okay, who can take responsibility for implementing solutions to those challenges. So this kind of illustrates our approach. So we're really identifying specific challenges and gaps in each country, either reported by the oxygen industry or by any public health or regulatory agency. And we're bringing the right people together to address the challenges by exploring actionable solutions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you once again, Steffi. Certainly early doors, like you say, for the initiative, but we'll be keeping an eye out on all of those developments, won't we? So many more questions and talking points that we could get into, and I'm sure that we'll do that in our audience Q&A. So for those of you watching, if you have a question for Steffi or for any of today's speakers, then please do send those in and we'll do our best to get them answered.
We will indeed, yes, so do get them in. But next up, we're going to speak with Mark Adkins, founder and CEO at LeanMed, the developer of the solar-powered medical oxygen production system, the O2 Cube. Mark also serves as the director and chair of the Product Development and Management Association and is an advisor to the Center for Medical Innovation at the University of Pittsburgh. During his corporate and consulting career, Mark and his teams have led product development projects that have launched numerous new products with lifetime sales of over $1 billion.
Mark, thank you for joining us today on this GasWorld webinar. You and I spoke earlier this year on our podcast, the 1895 podcast. But for those who haven't heard that, need a refresher or aren't familiar, then please introduce us to LeanMed and what your aims are with your solution, the O2 Cube.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for hosting this webinar today. It's a pleasure to be here. The background of LeanMed is that we came out of the University of Pittsburgh, where I was a professor teaching a course on managing product innovation, medical product innovation. One of my students had traveled to Africa, to Malawi, in 2018 and came back and talked about the number of children that died that year due to pneumonia, and it was a shock. And when we looked at the situation and tried to understand why there were so many deaths, it was frankly rather quickly we looked at the lack of oxygen available to those children, and when we looked at the reasons why, the root cause, we pretty quickly came to the idea of using solar power. So from that, we worked with Philips Healthcare, who is headquartered there. Their oxygen business was headquartered in Pittsburgh. They donated equipment to us. We licensed technology from them. And through a series of, in many ways, traditional startup, we went through 2 incubators. We competed in student competitions, won money, and with that developed the prototype, which eventually became the O2 Cube. With that, we've moved forward. We went to our commercial product and currently have systems operating in Uganda and in Nigeria for almost 2 years now, providing essential medical oxygen to smaller hospitals and health centers.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. And we should urge viewers to go back and listen to that full episode of the 1895 podcast that Tom referenced a moment ago. Perhaps we can put the link in the chat at some point in this webinar. I'd like to dive deeper into this solution now if I could. And I saw some statistics listed on your website stating that 800,000 children die every year from pneumonia, with 99% of those occurring in the developing world. And it just seems that we are perhaps so detached from that reality in certain other parts of the world. So why is there still such a gap in oxygen availability, and how can technologies such as yours address this?
So in the course of teaching about product innovation, the basics are you start with a problem worth solving. And this notion of children dying from pneumonia, as you point out, is an enormous problem. Hundreds of thousands of children dying every year, frankly, unnecessarily. And one of the prime causes is a lack of medical oxygen. The notion and what we are trying to bring to the market, if you will, with the O2Q is an economically sustainable product that can deliver oxygen reliably, dependably. There's a number of barriers that have to be overcome. These are the facilities tend to be outside city centers, so they're more remote. The grid electricity that they're provided is either very expensive or unreliable. The costs can be extremely high for the medical oxygen. So what we've done with the O2Q, by providing solar-powered, on-site medical oxygen production and storage in an easy-to-use format, in the O2Q, we've tried to overcome those barriers, and we think that really is the future. We want to scale the program. One of the many discussions that we had in the early days, and it still goes on, about are you in the business for profit? Are you in the business for social impact? And one of the things I taught in my course, and what I want people to take home with them, to recognize the goal of an entrepreneur is to hit scale. You want to scale your business. You want it to go large. Without scale, you don't create social impact. And that's what we want as well. We want to save those lives. So it's only through the scale up of an innovation like the O2Q that we're going to create the social impact and save hundreds of thousands of lives.
Absolutely.
Yes, thank you for that, Mark. And a final question, for now at least, and one that links back to what you've just said, and a barrier, and address the elephant in the room, I think, and that's financing. What financing model do you see as the most viable for scaling solutions such as the O2Q? Is it grants? Is it leasing, public-private partnerships, or something else?
All of the above. It can be all of the above. I think one point of emphasis I want to make is that we see the O2Cube as a product innovation that is economically viable, and it will not rely on a series of grants and funding. I think that's one of the models that's being challenged, is that, is it just all NGOs, donating money, and that's how you stay afloat? We've always developed and designed the O2Cube to be an economically viable product. The other piece of the equation, and it's part of the work that we're doing with Steffi and the GO₂AL group, is the notion, a business model innovation of oxygen as a service. And really, that's what we're implementing in both Uganda and Nigeria with partners there, with HealthPort in Nigeria and Afia in Uganda. So it's a product innovation, the O2Q, which tries to overcome some of those barriers. But in addition, providing oxygen as a service, where you have a small business that provides the other services, clinical, technical support, and removes the burden of maintaining equipment on those facilities. So we've been honored and blessed to be part of a program that is using oxygen as a service as the model. So I think that both of those, the product innovation of the O2 Cube, the business model innovation of oxygen as a service, and the funding that will come from the NGOs and the public-private partnerships. Essentially, that's what oxygen as a service represents. There will be public monies, government monies required to jumpstart it, but the goal of both Lean Med with the product innovation and the oxygen as a service innovators is to be long-term economically sustainable. And that's what we want. That's what I think these communities need.
Absolutely, we're in full support of that. And Tom and I were just saying off camera, we're still confounded by the huge gaps that we see and discuss in these markets. Well, thank you once again, Mark. We'll return to you in around 15 minutes' time for our audience Q&A. But before that, it's time to hear from our third and final speaker of the day, Gareth Pemberton, Director of Innovation at GCE.
Gareth, he's been at GCE for 11 years and guided a significant growth in the medical devices offering. He developed the portable oxygen concentrator range, new ranges in medical gas supply systems, and new ranges in suction and oxygen therapy. He is currently leading integrations of active technologies and Delta P following successful integration of Ohio medical and therapy equipment.
Gareth joined GCE from Air Products, where he started his career in 2004. His last position at Air Products was as a research and development manager, and prior to that, he had time in a wide range of roles, in particular in medical gases. He holds 2 master's degrees in engineering from the Warwick University and is a fellow of the Institute of Mechanical Engineering.
Gareth, welcome to the webinar, or welcome back, should I say. Thank you for joining us today. Now, we've been having some great conversations and insights today into medical oxygen in LMICs. So perhaps you could begin by running us through the role of appropriate new technologies when it comes to reshaping the oxygen supply chain in developing countries.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and thanks, Rob. And just to echo my fellow speakers, there is thanks for bringing this important topic. I think gasworld are doing a great job of bringing these policies and topics to the table, and the more we talk about them, the better, I think, for the whole industry. And yeah, thanks for the question there, because it's that term of appropriate technologies, I think, that's so super important when we talk about LMICs. Taking what we would normally just apply to European or US industry kind of base, and just expecting that to work in an LMIC environment, it's a wrong approach. And actually, you need to rethink what's the technology, what's the right approach for this place. So appropriate technology is absolutely the key thing here. Now, LMICs, as both the speakers have already explained, they provide a whole new range of challenges to the existing, should we say, broad scale of manufacturers in the medical device industry. And innovators like Mark are really able to change the game in looking at the approach in a fresh way. And as Steffi kind of really outlined, is you need to be able to understand the infrastructure and needs of those areas and how they're actually going to work. So there are all those challenges from the funding side of the devices. We've got to understand how the oxygen network is actually going to be built up, because often it's a brand new framework that's being created. There's lack of the, should we say, insurance policies that would kick in somewhere like America. There's a lack of base infrastructure investment. And in general, you're also dealing in areas where there isn't a network of liquid oxygen for industrial purposes that we can just run on the back of. So all those challenges are there, and that means that we need to think of it differently. And as Mark said, let's look at some other ways of approaching things. Oxygen as a service really challenges what a manufacturer does and what a supply chain network does. And it helps really change those funding models from being very capital intensive to suddenly becoming an OPEX spend. And that opens up, it just breaks down some barriers. And that means that we should think about things in a different way. And what Mark showed there with the generators is that you can do that. You can suddenly find a different way of working. And we've done that on several different programs as well. working with Global Health Foundation and with many other partners as well, is actually if you think about the technology in a different way, you can come back with a different solution. And I'd actually put the challenge back, particularly for the LMIC areas, is why not try and jump a few steps in technology? And if you take something traditional like oxygen cylinders and valves, well, we all know what that looks like. And we all know that, okay, that's a structure that you can scale. And we've seen that across all of our different geographies. But scaling that efficiently in an LMIC, actually, that's not going to work. That's going to end up with a very heavy capital investment and become rather difficult. So why not jump a few steps of technology, use some connected technologies, and you can actually start to build a much more efficient supply chain right from the beginning. So what may seem like extremely new technologies are actually extremely appropriate technologies in LMIC industries. And I think, yeah, that's a really interesting aspect to look at this space and challenge. And as Mark actually said there, the whole thing around innovation is taking on these challenges, and this is a wonderful space to really take that on. Yeah.
Fantastic, thank you, Gareth. And to focus in on the Middle East, India and China now, we see high growth in the infrastructure builds in these regions, a highly competitive market and, of course, strong cost pressures. Some might say that this in turn runs the risk of compromised quality. So how can the quality assurance to the patient be upheld?
Yeah, definitely. And I'm seeing a lot of this at the minute, but particularly with our new acquisition of Active Technologies, where we're working a lot closer into some of those markets. And you're seeing a lot of different approaches, particularly a lot of mixing of standards and compliance. And, essentially, there's a positive thing where a market is trying to find the lowest cost solution. But that's not always the right solution in many cases, particularly when you're mixing up different standards, mixing up different compliance elements, and you end up with a bit of a hodgepodge of different things. And who knows what's actually supposed to be the right approach for a particular geography, because we've all tried to find the lowest cost item. And I think, as Steffi also raised, is, yeah, there's a lot of barriers to some of the legislative portals and entrance to certain geographies. And I think that is a very mixed picture as you start to get into some of these new infrastructure builds. And strengthening that as an industry is something where we all have to kind of step up. And Steffi's, organisation of the roundtables is a really important step in moving that conversation forward. And for me, that's one of the really important things to do, because, as a manufacturer, I won't compromise on safety. I won't compromise on compliance. That's something that we will always bring to the table. And that doesn't mean that I have to compromise on price or cost or these kind of things. If we do the right product, we'll always get it to the right position and the right price. And as I said, if you take the view of appropriate technologies, you'll always find a really good solution for whatever that challenge is. But for me, the real key thing is how do we get that conversation of safety really raised up into the markets? Because we can't compromise the patient safety. We can't say a life in a certain country is different to another country. That's absolutely incorrect. And we all know oxygen is a super dangerous gas. It doesn't take a lot for it to go very badly wrong with oxygen. And you see that in some of the consequences with fires in hospitals, a number of incidents that are very deadly happen every single year. And we as an industry have a real role to play to eliminate those incidents and raise this topic and get a much better working standard across the board internationally.
Fantastic.
And I think that's, I was just going to say, I think that's something about really us all having the ability to engage with those key decision makers across the different parts of the industry. And this is really what Steffi's organisation is really trying to promote. And I think it's a super good cause. And the more manufacturers and players in the industry that can get behind her, the better.
Yes, thank you for that, Gareth. And sticking on the theme of infrastructure, around the world we do see aging infrastructure. So how do we upgrade this to meet the modern demands, as well as the more demanding requirements of those various regulatory bodies?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question as well. So as a manufacturer, you know, for the last few years, we've been going through all of the fun of MDR compliance, and for all the other manufacturers who are out there, they will all have felt my pain, and it's a positive pain at the end of the day, because you know changes in legislation, and of course MDR has been a very big change, but there's also been a lot of change in FDA and many other legislative requirements. So those changes are always there for better results for the patient. You know, that there's always a really good reasoning as to why those changes come through. And what does, you know, what does that actually impact then going forward is, you know, for example, MDR is such a good case to talk about, because we've all spent many years ensuring that we now get to a compliance position. The end of our transitions is coming up very quickly now, in just a couple of years. You know, and that leaves, you know, every device in Europe at now a different position to potentially what you offer in other locations from its compliance and safety perspectives. Now, again, as I said before, is like we as a manufacturer, we won't compromise on that. Something that we make to one standard, you know, that will always be our base standard then for everything else. You know, we take the highest element that we can. And what does that then mean, you know, when you consider what's out there in the field? Okay, so that's a really challenging question then, because from one day to the next, does that mean that that product is inappropriate to use? Does that mean that certain piece of infrastructure is now not the right thing to be using? And how do you actually just switch that? Because you can't change one day to the next. That's obviously not a practical thing to do. But what I think we as a whole industry have to do is get around the table and understand, but we need to acknowledge there are aging fleets, there are aging infrastructure, particularly in Europe, where there won't be these new infrastructure bills that we see in the Middle East, that we see in India, we see in China. That's not going to happen in Europe. There is a lot of old infrastructure that does need to get upgraded, because those new standards bring into play much stronger safety requirements. They bring in much stronger safety compliance from biocompatibility in particular, and all of that adds to better results to the patient. And we need to, as an industry, work out how to actually transition. Now we've had a transition in standards, how do we actually transition that into real life? And something that I call out there for us all to consider on is like, what are the ways that we can actually upgrade some of those things? You know, let's take an approach that software providers often do, and they look at things and say, well, yeah, actually, how can I make an upgrade into that to give it all the new features that we want to be able to provide for that particular piece of equipment? You know, that's a really good challenge for us all to consider, innovate around, and try and find really good solutions for. And yeah, I think that's you know, one of the big challenges that we're all going to face from a European perspective and US perspective, and that mixed in with the challenge that you see from LMICs. I think healthcare is an extremely exciting place for innovators to play in, and you know, we're certainly a very committed player in that space as well, and you certainly see that from what we have coming forward as well.
Thank you, Gareth. And just one final question now, and a quick look at the growing home care market and specifically technology. I was very privileged years ago now to visit the GCE HQ. You were one of my tour guides, in fact. It was great to see the investment in technologies, the dedication to quality and safety was of utmost importance. So let's talk technology. How can new home care technologies help in this area for both for patient and provider?
Yeah, definitely. So I think although we've seen, you know, a lot of new technology come into that home care space, particularly with POCs, you know, POCs have now been in the market, should we say, circa sort of 15 years, and had a really good impact to a lot of patients. You know, we're talking about devices that, as we drive a technology, they get smaller, they get lighter, the performance improves. And that's kind of like what I'd say is that's core technology improvement. You know, we all know that doing that directly improves patient care. And, that's an exciting space to work in. There is still a lot to do with, how a POC can operate. And from the other side of things is also how a cylinder can deliver gas as well. That a lot of people point to and sort of say, well, yeah, is that a dying space? No, I don't think it is at all. I think actually cylinders have an absolutely important part to play in a home care supply chain. It's got to be the right technology for the right patient usage and the right location that patient is as well. Now, there are lots of technologies, I also think, that can be deployed into the home care environment that can give even more transformational responses. And if you look to, what would seem some obvious changes, like a connected device in this space, would help to provide more remote care and insight to the patients. And ultimately, that's a far better patient care perspective. And the adoption of those technologies is actually quite slow in the home care market. And some of that's really interesting for us to have a look at, because we need to understand, well, how does the market, change? Is it something the really market wants to have? How do we get the patient care to work with these? Because clearly there's something good with these technologies, but how do we actually really make and drive value from them? So I think that's a really interesting question for the whole home care market to really understand. And then there's further development in technologies like wearable devices that can really get, the innovator's mind spinning to think about, yeah, when can we actually just deliver the oxygen that's needed for the patient, and how can we better manage that? Because at the end of the day, that's going to give the very best patient care if we can manage, on a one-to-one basis, minute by minute, what our patient actually needs from an oxygen supply chain. And that opens up loads of other opportunities as well. So as Mark explained as well, when you use this oxygen as a service model, it starts to transform all of those different landscapes. So I think there's a really interesting mix, hopefully, coming in that home care space where, wearable tech, connected tech, different services into the market can all start to play and ultimately provide more and better care for that patient base. And then we all know that is going to be an increasing patient base. That's a clear trend in the market. Every indication is in that space. We all know as we live longer, there is more lung issues. Something like COVID is going to happen again. All of those factors are there, and that's why that home care market is so super important for us as an industry, and one that is hopefully going to bring a lot of exciting new challenges and changes. And I'd like to see also how some of that filters down into the rest of the devices that we provide for medical oxygen and other therapies.
Fantastic. Plenty of food for thought there. Thank you once again, Gareth, and we'll be back with you during our live audience Q&A, I'm sure, which is just a few moments away now. So to those watching, please do keep sending those questions in.
Yes, please do. And while you're sending those in, let us take just a few minutes to tell you about our upcoming Asia Pacific Industrial Gases Conference 2025, taking place in just over a week's time in Bangkok, Thailand.
That's right. Between December 2nd and 4th, we'll be taking GasWorld events to the Shangri-La, Bangkok, for what is set to be a fantastic event and a fantastic opportunity, as this conference will bring together senior executives, technology providers, and regional stakeholders to explore the growth, challenges, and innovation in the industrial gases sector across the Asia-Pacific region.
So whether you're in production, distribution, downstream, or anything in between, having a presence in the region is increasingly important, and visibility at this event will give you just that.
Along with networking opportunities, we'll also have 6 sessions allowing you to gain insight into region-specific trends from a host of industry experts covering market dynamics, growth opportunities, sustainability, specialty gases, and so much more.
And if that's not enough, the event will also play host to the inaugural GO₂AL Awards, where we will recognise excellence in industrial gas and equipment, innovation and leadership.
Some last-minute tickets, exhibition space and sponsorship opportunities are still available. So to get more information on that, visit gasworld.com/events or get in touch with a member of the GasWorld team today.
Absolutely, you really don't want to miss out. But let's now get back to this webinar, and we do still have a few minutes to answer some audience questions with our panel of industry experts. So let's get straight into those. Tom?
Yes. First off, Steffi, I'm going to come to you with a question that Anthony has sent in. Anthony says, across those 3 pilot countries that you mentioned, where do you most need industry input, technical, operational, financial, or training support? And does that look different in each of those 3 countries?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, but quite difficult to answer clearly at this stage, because of course, across these 3 pilot countries, the types of industry support that is needed will differ a lot, because Senegal, Uganda, and South Africa are very different countries. And they are at very different stages in developing their oxygen ecosystems. So like Senegal is, for example, finalizing its roadmap. So maybe more like technical support, operational input, to define a realistic infrastructure and regulatory plans is most valuable for you for Senegal. While Uganda has prioritized oxygen for a longer time, and they already have published 2 roadmaps. So, industry support is more about implementation there. So maybe financial models, operation, workforce training as well. And then South Africa prioritized liquid oxygen for a long time. So again, that needs an entirely different approach. So we probably need to focus more on clarifying the South African regulatory landscape there, focus more on logistics, supply chain challenges. So we are still in the process of defining the precise needs for each country. We're talking to the ministries of health, regulatory authorities, and other national stakeholders to identify those country-specific challenges from their experience and point of view. And like I said before, we're just getting started with those country-specific meetings where identifying the country-specific challenges and gaps are a very important agenda item, because those assessments will then allow us to articulate where the industry can add the most value. So if that's technical expertise, if that's financial partnerships, training programs, operational, so any other form of collaboration. But we need to do that in a way that's tailored for each country's realities and identify challenges and gaps.
Great, thank you for that, Steffi.
Yeah, thank you, Steffi. We'll come to Mark now. We've got another question also from Anthony. Mark, Anthony says, in trying to scale oxygen as a service, what have you learned about what actually makes that model succeed or fail when you hand it over to local partners? I think we've got you on mute there, Mark.
Thank you. That's also a good question. I think probably it starts with the local entrepreneur, the local oxygen as a service company, having a strong relationship with the healthcare facility, be it a smaller hospital or a larger health center. And what they bring, right? We try to bring, if you will, the equipment, the O2 cube, the solar powered production and storage system. So we make that available to the oxygen as a service provider. What they layer on that's so important is the technical and clinical support. So for example, in Nigeria, HealthPort is our partner there. And the founder is Aisha Adeniji, Dr. Aisha Adeniji. And she brings a really strong clinical focus to the work that they do with their customers. And one of the remarkable learnings that we've experienced over the last 2 years is that these facilities treat oxygen previously as a very scarce resource, something that must be rationed. Only certain patients get it in certain situations. And once you can remove that scarcity mentality, it's remarkable what happens. More patients are treated more effectively, but there's an entire clinical training element that has to come in. that, again, LeanMed is not positioned to provide, but a company like HealthPort is. So what they bring is this clinical expertise. They train the nurses and the doctors, where once it was maybe one or two individuals who knew how to diagnose and prescribe oxygen. Now the entire staff can do that. So that's the kind of value that these oxygen as a service providers bring. And a footnote, an important footnote to that, is that what you recognize and what happens pretty rapidly is what you said was X amount of demand for oxygen, 1x, it becomes 2x or 3x, because now it's not a rationed therapy. There's an abundance, and now the people that need it get it. And I think that so importantly gets overlooked, and all the analysis is done, all the wonderful national scale-up plans that the different countries have done when they're trying to articulate what the demand is for oxygen in their country. My belief is they've completely underestimated it. And so the problem is probably even larger than we think. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Mark. I have a question here from Johannes and Gareth. You may be able to address this. We discussed regulations and standards. So Johannes says, what does a practical application of ISO 18562 in production look like with regard to cleanliness?
Okay, so yeah, 18562 in terms of production, well, it depends on the devices that you're manufacturing and the requirements that then goes against that. So obviously there's a risk assessment piece that you need to go through, which is well identified in that particular standard set. And then, yeah, you need to reflect that back onto your devices. So if you've got patient contacting devices, you need to make sure that in your manufacturing space, you're not going to be contaminating that with potential diseases, pathogens, etc., that you could then transport onwards. Now, that doesn't always mean that you need to be sterilizing products, and that comes across as a really quite often discussion, particularly when you're talking to some areas to put devices into the US. They like that discussion. But in terms of what does it look practically, yes, it really does depend on the device level that you're building. So on one extent, it could be full clean room, full sterilization of a product. And to the other side of things, well, that could well be a segregated workspace with, a very controlled environment in terms of temperature, dust ingress, those kind of things. But, you could be anywhere in the spectrum along the side of that. So I hope that kind of answers the question. But if he's got some specifics and specific products he wants to actually have some discussion around, then yeah, it's either laid out in the standards or come and ask me that a bit more separately, and I can give a very precise answer on it. We've got manufacturing that is across all of those elements. So he's there, yeah.
Thanks for that, Gareth. And I see Johannes is still watching. So Johannes, if you do want to discuss that further, then reach out to Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Gareth. As someone that's not familiar with ISO 18562, Tom and I were very relieved you could answer that. We'll try with another one now. Richard observes rather than ask a question, but says, emergency oxygen for CPR, Narcan administration, pool safety, and first aid solutions require discussion. Are these something that come up in conversation for you, for GCE?
Do you want to just repeat that one again? So I missed the last part of that. Then.
Yeah, sure. Richard says emergency oxygen for CPR, Narcan administration, pool safety, and first aid requires discussion. Yeah. Is that something you agree with? Is that something that comes up for you in GCE?
Yeah. So first aid is, yeah, definitely. This is quite an interesting space, because we used to actually provide a number of product lines into that first aid kind of space. And it's not as clear cut as in, what are your requirements from a medical devices space. So we used to have some products that kind of straddled a little bit the two. So I actually do agree with that. I think that is much a much kind of like overlooked space that, from a legislative perspective, there is a gap in standard, in terms of what you're requiring from a medical device doing exactly the same kind of treatment is very much more than what's actually required if you just put that to a first aid element. So in particular, devices that would go into mines for recovery of patients and so forth who've inhaled some exotic gases whilst they're down there. So yeah, I absolutely agree with him. I think it's an important area that the safety standards can definitely be improved on.
Fantastic. Thanks again for taking that one.
Yes, thank you, Gareth. Mark, going to return to you now with another question we've had in from Anthony. And Anthony references the 1895 podcast that we recorded earlier this year and says that you discussed your Nigeria and Uganda projects on that. So how are they progressing now? And do you have any updates on Tanzania and Kenya? Are you moving closer to building that cross-country marketplace that you mentioned?
Okay. Yes, thank you. Yes, so the operations are doing well in Nigeria and Uganda. We're proud of that work, and it's making an impact. It's making a difference. We're currently installing a system in Tanzania, and the work in Kenya. We don't have installations there yet, but I spent a week in Nairobi in June, and we have a number of opportunities there as well. Frankly, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, there are so many opportunities that we're looking at, and the need is so great. It's hard to describe. I think the challenge, and it's really, I'm excited for the work that Steffi and the team is doing with the roundtable, is that it's the funding side. And maybe that's the elephant in the room. You've asked me some questions before about what's the elephant in the room. And unfortunately, the elephant in the room is that these nations lack funding. They're not rich nations. And so over and over again, it's disappointing to me, frankly. I think we have a very viable, economically sustainable, and a very positive innovation that's going to bring oxygen to the people that need it. But at the end of the day, who can pay for it? And there are models out there, like public-private partnerships, that we're exploring, and Steffi is well aware of that, and the team there at ATMF. But in my opinion, if you want my view, that's the challenge. There was tremendous amount of money that came in during COVID. It accomplished some tremendous things, but it also exposed some problems. And my hope is that funding can come again through public-private partnerships. And that's why we stay up, every day we get up with the goal in mind to bring oxygen to the people that need it.
Great, thank you for that, Mark.
Yeah, we need to keep oxygen in the public health architecture at all times, not just during pandemics. Gareth, let's come to you with our next and possibly final audience question. Sujes says, how do we convince clients not to accept mixed standard medical gas components and to understand that these shortcuts actually compromise patient safety and damage the facility's credibility? What would your strategy be to move forward?
Certainly. So he's hitting on some of the commentary that I'd put there, and yeah, it's something that we are facing, very regularly, I would say, as well. So a lot of what we're doing, in that kind of scenario is actually walking through with the client, where we have, certain differences, what the reasoning behind those differences are, how you get to the right safety standards, why they're in place, what are the reasonings behind those as well. So, we touched on cleanliness already in that previous question. That's a really basic, item to kind of go through with the potential customers and clients in those spaces, is, running through that very base level of saying, hey, look, number one, we've got oxygen. This is a dangerous gas. Education around oxygen is quite important for a number of those stakeholders. And then number two to that is, right, now this means that we need to have a very clean production line that runs across it. This is how we do it. This is why we have compliance to something like 15,001, right? And then you start moving through all of those steps, and you start to show how all of those standards build up the picture of what a really good, safe device is. And I think once you've taken a client, customer, a tender, all those kind of things through all of that kind of process, you start to build, a lot of trust around what you're doing and why you're doing it in those particular ways. And I think that's the way that, we as a manufacturer can approach it. But I think there's a role there as an industry. You have to be able to get not just the stakeholder of the, the particular infrastructure build, should we say, involved in that dialogue on a one-to-one, but you also need to have influencers that are at different levels to have those conversations as well. And again, that's why Steffi's roundtable group is so super important, because it helps to bring those stakeholders together and have that conversation and those education points. And there's forums there that would enable then manufacturers to all put out, like, yeah, this is a widely adopted set of standards. This is why we want to manufacture to these to these requirements, and that helps overall push the industry upwards. And that, for me, that's the important elements of where we've seen a lot of really significant change with NDR requirements and FDA uplifts, and the standard that was mentioned previously, 18562, is actually one of those really key ones that brings a lot of change to devices. And pulling that all through to these new markets, I think, is really important to do. And that's how, my kind of view on it. And I'm sure lots of people here also have lots of thoughts on that too. But I really recommend what Steffi's doing in trying to uplift what we're doing in the space.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for sharing those views, Gareth.
Yes, thank you for that. Now, we're approaching that time where we start to wrap up this webinar and get the final views and the final thoughts of our experts. So first off, Steffi, I'm going to come to you from the Access to Medicine Foundation. If you had one thing that you'd like to see from our industry, the industrial gases industry, in order to progress, move forward, to close that gap in oxygen availability, then what would that be?
That's a good question. So for us, for our initiative to work, it's really important that these companies are willing to share data. And I'm not talking about confidential financial data. We really need to identify the challenges that they are facing in those pilot countries, because that's our first step. Like, if we don't identify what's going wrong, then how are we ever gonna create collaborations or talk to the Ministry of Health to improve things? So for us, it's just data sharing is really key. So we need them to show up to our pilot country monthly meetings, be open in sharing these things. We always ask for every meeting, we ask our industry partners to prepare like 2 or 3 questions. Based on that, we put those topics on the agenda. So what we need for now is data. That's it, because in those countries, there's not a lot of data available on demand, and there's not a lot of data available on the challenges that are being faced. So we just ask the companies to be open with us and share data.
Sure, thank you for that, Steffi. And Gareth, I'll come to you next. If you had one final takeaway from this webinar, one final message to those watching today, then what would that be?
Yeah, I think definitely look at the partners on this call. It's a great set of people, and how the industry can really work together. I know both Steffi and Mark for a little bit of time, and I think they're really helping change the industry. I mean, innovation there is really a huge opportunity for us all, and with the right partners, I think we can make a real change to actual patient lives. And as Mark iterated this a number of times, actually, when you see the difference in the statistics of survival rates with oxygen treatment, it is dramatic, and we're not doing ourselves justice as a global industry by not providing these solutions.
Thank you for that, Gareth. And finally, Mark, if you had a message to those watching today, what would that be?
First of all, to thank you for this platform, this opportunity to speak about this important issue. Also to thank Gareth and Steffi. Yeah, it is an honor to be on the panel with them. They're terrific contributors. And I think my message would be, as a lifelong innovator, a product development person, my hope is that our innovation, the notion of bringing solar power on-site medical oxygen production and storage, it is a breakthrough innovation. And when you create a new product category, it's incredibly difficult because nobody has heard of it before. So it's a long, tough road. But I think the value is compelling. That's what gets us up every morning. And we keep working at this because we think it really is an important element, not the total solution. We've talked about oxygen service. We've talked about collaboration. There's so many other elements that go into it as well. But I do want to emphasize product innovation, which I think we've brought to this space. And I hope we can fulfill that dream. So thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and we certainly hope you do too. And medical
Absolutely.
oxygen is, of course, a theme that we'll continue to champion here at GasWorld, but sadly that is all we have time for today. Our thanks once again to Steffi Van Uytfanghe of the Access to Medicine Foundation, Mark Atkins of LeanMed, and Gareth Pemberton of GCE.
We do have just a couple more webinars to come this year. Firstly, on December 5th, we'll be continuing the medical gases conversation and welcoming back GCE Medical as we discuss the challenges faced by hospitals and healthcare providers worldwide and reimagining hospital gas management. That's easy for me to say. You can register for that for free at gasworld.tv.
We may only have a couple of build webinars remaining in this year, but do keep your eyes peeled for a selection of year in review webinars over the coming weeks. A series of short format webinars where we'll be looking back on the key topics and news stories throughout 2025 and speaking with those involved. I know for a fact we'll be covering the theme of distribution with a selection of experts already, with hopefully some more of those to come as well.
And lots to look forward to and look back on, of course. We'll be announcing all of those on our socials as well as gasworld.tv. So as Tom said, do keep an eye out for those. You can, of course, also revisit this webinar or any of our previous GasWorld webinars by utilising our on-demand service. Every single previous broadcast is available to watch at a time that suits you and completely free of charge, also at gasworld.tv.
And as mentioned earlier, GasWorld's Asia Pacific Industrial Gas Conference 2025 is just around the corner from December 2nd to 4th. For more information on that, visit gasworld.com/events.
But lastly, as always, our final thanks of the day go to you, the viewer, in homes and offices around the world for both watching and participating. And until next time, it's a goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.